that's a great way to start, because I looked at the agenda and someone's title was, STC update, and I'm like, oh, here's a stakeholder-centered approach to resolving conflict in fisheries management, reflections of the LEPMAG process. I gave like a really long title. I thought, oh dear, I missed the point. Are you advancing the slides, or is this one? This one will. So I'm really honored to be here to talk to you guys about work that has really developed over quite a long time. I've just been involved the last 20 minutes of it feels like. So this is a group of researchers that either are at or have been through the Quantitative Fisheries Center at MSU, as Kurt mentioned. Really starting out with Aaron Berger, Matt Catalano, obviously involving Mike Jones, myself, Lisa Peterson, and our newest addition, who you guys haven't met. I'm excited to introduce John Sislow, who's a new postdoc, going to be helping us out with some of the yellow perch stuff as we move forward. So to give a brief overview of what I'll cover, I'm going to talk about the history of perkid management, but obviously you guys know plenty about the history of perkid management in Lake Erie, but I'm going to focus on how it led to the development of this stakeholder-centered approach. I think Kurt's talk really kind of set the stage for me really well. I'm going to talk about the history of why this process was initiated. And the review of the process, as Kurt also mentioned, is going to be kind of walleye focused, because we're further along in that process than we are with yellow perch right now. But I will give updates on where we are for both walleye and yellow perch, and then talk a little bit about where we're going to move in terms of going forward. So in 1970, there was a harvest moratorium on walleye because of contaminant levels. And in 1976, the first international quotas were introduced for walleye on Lake Erie. And obviously there's a ton of history between 1976 and 2004, but the reason that's the next year on the timeline is in 2004, consensus among agencies over walleye harvest was reached and then subsequently breached. And so this breach of consensus happened after the TAC was actually determined in late 2003 and accepted. And so this kind of breach of consensus really set the stage for a couple of different things and initiated some of what I'll be talking about today. There was varying degrees of contention, not only among the stakeholders, but also between stakeholders and managers. And so in 2005, the LEC initiated a new 5-year walleye management plan that actually involved stakeholders. But while it was involving the stakeholders, it wasn't the direct result of a stakeholder-centered approach. And so moving forward in the timeline in 2010, agencies came forward and the LEC initiated what came to be known as the Lake Erie Perkid Management Advisory Group, involving the stakeholders, the fisheries managers, the biologists, the specialists, and the modelers, and to formally incorporate the information provided by the stakeholders into the decision-making process in a really explicit way. And so, as Kurt mentioned, there's about 35 members. We've had 14 meetings, and they're ongoing. They tend to be a full day of discussion. And what it allows for is the discussion of what management objectives really are, what the current assessment models that are being used, how they perform and what they do, and also a chance for us to discuss potential refinements. So the results from the modeling team are brought forward to everyone and discussed to see what everyone's opinions are. And it gives us also a chance to invite outside experts, as we mentioned, the technical review panel, to give us a third-party assessment of how we're doing. What are we doing well? What could we do better? And finally, it gives a forum to develop performance metrics that stakeholders actually agree upon. So, in fisheries, everyone's going to always have different points of view and their own jurisdiction's interests in mind, but this explicitly gives a forum to discuss what performance metrics would be acceptable. So the vision statement of LEPMAG is that Lake Erie perkid fisheries will be transparently managed using sound science and partnerships to achieve stable and sustainable harvests from shared stocks, providing broad and equitable benefits for all jurisdictions. So with that vision statement in mind, rules of engagement were developed by the group to guide the process. And so it really has this kind of shift from focusing on what we have different in our conflict and towards what we have shared in terms of our management goals. And so the primary option for dealing with our management goals is to adjust the fishing rates in the commercial and recreational fisheries. And there are three primary objectives that we focus on with the LEPMAG process. The first is to minimize the economic risk to commercial fishermen. The second is to maintain acceptable catch rates for recreational fishers. And then the third, more biologically relevant objective is to minimize the risk of low spawning stock abundance. And we're doing this through the management strategy evaluation. And so rather than just looking at one performance metric at a time or looking at the stock assessment output 1 year at a time, what the management strategy evaluation allows us to do is model the entire management system and evaluate the performance of alternative management procedures and see what's going to happen in the future. And so not only are we looking at the system as a whole, but it also allows us to allow for uncertainty. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in this diagram. So we have, the data that we collect from the harvest and the surveys. We have our stock assessment model and our harvest policies. So that kind of gives us what our current management action really is. But there's uncertainty associated with that. And so through the management strategy evaluation process, we can incorporate what the outcome uncertainty is when we're actually running the population models that we currently have in place. We also turn off the screen. We also have model uncertainty and just natural variation in things like the recruitment dynamics and the population dynamics in general. And so the other part of the management strategy evaluation is, I feel like I'm going to blind you guys with this thing. I'm sorry if I do. Sorry if you're blind. Forecast of what actually happens accounts for that model uncertainty. And then we also have observation uncertainty. And so we take all of that into account when we're moving forward a forecast of what we actually observe. And so we take the stock assessment model and we put it into a prospective model that's going to forecast what's going to happen in the future and allow us to examine how different fisheries policies are actually going to perform and affect the population. But we don't know, we have no complete knowledge of what the system really is or of how well our model is going to perform. So we also look at the risks associated with that uncertainty through this process. So the harvest policy analysis is essentially based on determining what the target fishing mortality should be and also what the assessed stock biomass is. And so using both of these, we come up with our target fishing mortality and our limit reference points with respect to biomass. And we explicitly account for risk by using a risk-based limit reference point, which is the P star. And so this common schematic that is used shows the fishing mortality rate as a percent of FMSY on the y-axis and the stock biomass as a percent of the maximum on the x-axis. And so where our target and limit reference points come together, that creates our harvest control rule. And so the limit reference point is with respect to the stock biomass relative to that maximum. And so we can look at different percentages to see where that limit reference point would best perform. And our target fishing rate is relative to the FMSY. So essentially we're looking at how much of the maximum can we fish. And those two things along with the risk association are what we use to do the management strategy evaluation. So this is a super busy figure, and I've broken it all down. I hope that this works. This is just looking at the spawner biomass in terms of millions of kilograms on the y-axis. And in this first little bit, I'm just showing you what the management strategy evaluation gives us in terms of various F targets, ranging from 40 to 80% of FMSY. So you've got 40%, 50%, 60%. And so you do a subsequent model run on each of these to see what kind of spawner biomass you get out. And so what you're showing essentially is just that with increasing F, you have a decreasing spawner biomass. That makes sense to everyone, right? Okay, so the next thing we add on is different levels of risk. So P-star is essentially a measure of your risk of overfishing. P-star gives you the probability that your spawning stock biomass at whatever level you're fishing is going to fall below your spawning stock biomass if you had no fishing. So as you have an increasing risk of that happening, you're essentially having a worse and worse scenario for the population in terms of spawner biomass. But if you look at these 4 scenarios, so this is at a 0.05 risk, this is at 0.1, 0.3, and 0.5, it's really, as you look across the mean, it doesn't look like there's a huge effect. And so just keep that in mind as we go through the subsequent parts of this figure. But the third and final layer that we add on top is the limit reference point in terms of biomass. So we looked at it in terms of 20% of the spawning stock biomass at no fishing. And so that's this entire block is showing you the range of Fs for each of the P stars across this 20% of SSB naught limit reference point. This is for the 30% limit reference point. And that's showing, again, those F targets, each of the P star values, and the limit reference point. And then for the full thing, you see at 40%, there's kind of a different pattern. So these first two don't look all that different, right? But the third one, you see kind of a different pattern in terms of the output results for the 40% SSB naught. And so what we took away from this essentially is that you don't see a whole lot of difference in the response of the population to various management strategies of F until you get to this most conservative spawning stock biomass. And so that's important to keep in mind because you're trying to get at that perfect balance between how much you can sustainably fish and how much you need to conserve. And so this pattern is what we see in general for the spawner biomass. But when you look at mean commercial yield, you see a very different pattern. So again, they're not very different in these first 2 P stars, but in this final, first 2 SSB knots, but in this final 40% SSB knot scenario, there's quite a different pattern where you have increasing pounds of walleye in terms of commercial yield when you have increasing F, and it's not, you don't see that pattern in this most conservative P star, in other words, the 0.05 scenario. But what I like about these figures is that it really well demonstrates that this pattern is almost reversed for the angler harvest. So if you think about it, when you have an increasing F target, your millions of walleye for the mean angler harvest actually seems to go down with the increasing F target. And as you move across, you see a very similar pattern again until this most conservative SSB naught value. And so looking at those 2 figures back to back, you might think, well, for every unit of risk that you use as a commercial angler interest, you give up the same amount of risk in terms of the angler harvest. And so just to kind of put that into perspective, what we created were these trade-off plots. Essentially on the y-axis you have the probability of the angler catch per hour falling below 0.4, and on the x-axis you have the probability of the commercial yield falling below 4 million pounds. And those 2 thresholds were actually determined by the stakeholders as what would be an unacceptable threshold. And so this is one scenario. Since we saw kind of similar results no matter what your SSB naught percentage was in those 3 blocks until you got to the most conservative, we modeled here what the 20% SSB naught scenario would look like. That's all I'm going to show in this presentation. And it's also using the most, so that's kind of the least conservative of the SSB naught percentages. And the P star, which is the risk of overfishing, also didn't have a huge amount of effect relative to what the, I'm going to go back, even though you shouldn't. So the F targets are having a pretty large effect on what you have in terms of your output relative to the changes across these scenarios. Does that make sense? So in terms of impact, what you might want to look at in terms of varying would be the F targets. And so that's what I'm going to be showing you in this figure. So as you move along the F target relative to the FMSY, you're increasing your fishing mortality rate. And so this is what this plot is showing you what would happen at the target F being 40% of FMSY. This is at 50% of FMSY and 60% of FMSY. And as you add it on, you see this really sharp upturn in the pattern. And so what you might think at, like just logically, at low to intermediate fishing mortality rates, you might expect a one-to-one kind of trade-off between these two thresholds because of the risk being the same for both of them, and or the P star and the B limit reference point. But what we see is there's really quite a change in the angle of the relationship between these points. So for every 10%, you are not getting the same amount of trade-off, or the same amount of risk for the commercial and recreational fishermen. And so this really captures all of what the MSC is modeling and shows you, when you boil it down to what is this going to mean in terms of risk to each of the stakeholder groups, it gives you kind of something to compare what the trade-off really would be. And so based on all of this information, and presented to the LEPMAG was a lot more information than I can fit in 25 minutes, but this is just to get you a feel of what the management strategy evaluation really is and does, and the usefulness of it in terms of our decision making. So the LEPMAG recommended the target F of 60% of FMSY. And as Kurt mentioned, based on the recommendations from LEPMAG, the updated assessment model was adopted, the new harvest control rule was also formally adopted, and it was first applied during this 2014 tax setting process for Lake Erie walleye. So the 2015 walleye management plan is actually making use of this really stakeholder-centered approach to this new harvest control rule. And so I'm not going to talk nearly as long about yellow perch, don't worry. But for model refinements with yellow perch, we have incorporated estimation of the age-specific selectivity into the model. We also included the random walk catchability and the multinomial age composition. And finally, a multi-model approach to the survey indices in terms of coming up with recruitment index values. And we had our technical review panel come in 2014, and two of their main recommendations were to look at the extended age structure for the model. So in certain MUs and certain years, there was quite a bit of the age composition in that plus group. Right now we're modeling yellow perch ages 2 through 6 plus. And it seems like there might be, especially because of that one big recruitment event, there might be a bit more age structure that we're not capturing that we need to. So they recommended that we look into that. And then also, and probably more importantly, we're going forward with developing a two-sex model. And so yellow perch are pretty well known to be sexually dimorphic in their growth. And if we don't capture that in our models, we might be really missing information about how the population is going to respond to our fishing policies. And so the next step will be, once those structural changes are complete, to complete this prospective modeling and do the management strategy evaluation for yellow perch in the same way we did for walleye. So the LEPMAG process itself is really designed to facilitate the understanding amongst stakeholders of their shared management goals. As I said, we're trying to shift the focus away from what we have different and move it towards what we have shared. We want to have sustainable harvest as long as we can, as best as we can. And in order to do that, we need to provide a forum for discussion of concerns of areas of risk for conflict, because we can either have a very kind of closed off and angsty discussion or lack of discussion, or we can put everyone's conflicts or needs on the table and discuss them explicitly. And it really gives a chance for an objective quantification of what we need to do to reach everyone's goals. And it's not going to be the optimal for everyone, but it's going to be something that everyone can live with. And so that's the important part of this entire process, is that it builds trust in the fisheries management process, because everyone has buy-in, everyone is involved. There's no one that gets a note afterwards saying, oh yeah, this is what this will be. They got a chance to discuss all of the parts of what is going to be put into place. And I think that's a pretty important point, is that we hope to measure the impact of this process. Surveys measuring the responses of both the managers and the stakeholders have been administered throughout the LEPMAG process. And the participants were asked to rank on a Likert scale how strongly they agreed or disagreed with statements such as the current harvest control rule appropriately balances the objectives of the different stakeholder groups. And the other examples below. And so what we're trying to get at is whether the knowledge and the actual attitude towards the process has been impacted by LEPMAG. The survey results so far have shown a significant change in stakeholder views. Greater satisfaction of the management process is essentially what we're seeing, which is pretty exciting. So in just a quick kind of mean overview of what the surveys show, they have about 20 questions, and the results so far show a sign change in the mean responses of the stakeholders. And in all cases, the change was in the direction we hypothesized. So if you had a question like, the current harvest control rule appropriately balances objectives, you would expect or hope for a positive sign change for that question. For a question like, the objectives of commercial and recreational fishing stakeholders are in conflict, you would hope that you would have a negative sign change, and that would be decreasing through time. And we, in fact, saw that. And so we're getting a good measure of how this process is, in fact, impacting the management of the fishery and also the levels of understanding of the stakeholders. And so because we're getting all of this exciting results, we boldly would like to say that we think the process is beneficial. And I'm really excited about it because I think that it has some really broad applicability. If I can give just a quick kind of looking forward slide about what we want to do as we move on. Mark Gaden from GLFC, I don't know where he is, he's in here somewhere. Back in 2005 was working on his dissertation, and this was just after that kind of breach of consensus had happened. And he took that opportunity to do some semi-structured interviews with the managers to talk about how the Joint Strategic Plan really affects them personally and their work, and talk about the breakdown of the consensus that occurred. And so we have those survey data that, or those interviews that, when paired with the surveys we've done so far, really present a unique opportunity to look at how this institutional response, how the creation of LEPMAG itself has actually impacted the whole process. So we have the interviews from Mark in 2004 and 5, we have the surveys from the last 14 years, and we're proposing through a new pre-proposal that I hope gets invited for a submission to do some more interviews to get a longitudinal look at what response change has been like. So this isn't just something about Lake Erie and Perkins. This is really a chance for us to take this template and talk about conflict resolution in a way that might be applicable to lots of other contentious resource issues, such as salmonids in the Great Lakes, or just fisheries management in general. I mean, these are broadly applicable questions that I think we're really getting good answers to. And so with that, I will say thank you for your attention and take any questions.